Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Matthews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining our futures. This episode is a conversation with Catarina de Albuquerque, Chief Executive Officer from 2014 of Sanitation and Water for All, a global partnership. It was so much fun speaking with her, and Catarina is one very bright spark. For the past 14 years, she has spearheaded and been on the forefront of human rights discourse around water and sanitation, both in the United Nations human rights system and now with this global partnership. She has traveled extensively, spoken with numerous people over the years, government officials, private actors, and most importantly, with those who face the greatest deprivation when it comes to water and sanitation and confront severe inequalities. She is a natural storyteller, so we do hope you enjoy the episode as much as we do. Catarina, first, let me welcome you to The Subverse. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here with us.
It's my pleasure, my great pleasure, Susan, not only to catch up with you again and see you again, but also to have a discussion about these topics that keep me going and that excite me so much.
Thank you so much. So why don't we start with this, which is that for the past 14 years, you have dedicated so much of your substantial time and effort to the issues around water and sanitation. Firstly, within the United Nations human rights system, you were appointed as the first special rapporteur in 2008. And then in 2010, you played a pivotal part in the recognition of the rights of water and sanitation in the General Assembly. And post that, your subsequent work has helped ensure that the rights of water to sanitation have also been incorporated into the language of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's been a really busy and exciting 14 years for you. So I would really like you to tell us a little bit about all of this. Give us the gist of it. And also for, I think, many of our listeners, they don't know much about human rights and they don't know much about the United Nations system. So it would be really good to hear from you what that means for people who may not know what that means.
So, as you said, Susan, in 2008, I was appointed Special Rapporteur, and I wasn't the Special Rapporteur on the human rights to water and sanitation because those rights had not yet been recognized. So I was asked to study human rights obligations regarding water and sanitation. So what are the legal obligations that states, that governments and others that states have at the national level in terms of making sure that people get access to water and sanitation? And even if they weren't, because that was the situation back then, even if they hadn't yet been recognized as rights, yet specifically, did the states have already certain obligations towards people that related to their health, that related to the right to housing, that related to the right to education, that related to gender, non-discrimination, etc. And obviously my answer to all of these questions is yes, 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 yes. Obviously, even before those rights were explicitly recognized in 2010, governments already had obligations regarding these rights or regarding water and sanitation, because in order for you to ensure that kids don't die with diarrhea, you need to make sure that they have clean drinking water. If you want to ensure the right to housing, which is a universally recognized right, well, you need to make sure that the dwellings have access to water, but also to sanitation. If you want to ensure the right to food, well, water is part of the right to food. It's the liquid dimension of the right to food, and etc. The same with education. If you want to ensure the right to education, you must make sure that girls stay in school, even when they are menstruating, that they don't drop out because there are no sex-segregated toilets in school or because their families don't have the money to purchase sanitary pads. So yes, 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 governments have a myriad, independently of the recognition of the rights as such. Governments already had a myriad of obligations because they had recognized other rights, right? They had already a myriad of obligations when it came to water and to sanitation and to hygiene. Then, yes, they were recognized. And I must say that since I was appointed, my ambition was to get the rights recognized, obviously. Was there, as you were asking, what does this mean and does that have any positive value add? Let me first answer the first questions and then let me come to the what does it mean question. Especially when I said the states already had obligations. So, Catarina, if states had obligations, why are you adding up to the list of rights? I will get there. First, UN General Assembly. So I was appointed in 2008. My mandate was going to finish in 2011. I was supposed to make recommendations to the UN Human Rights Council about what I had found out during my first 3 years of work. And what I had thought was I will recommend to the Human Rights Council that the right is recognized in 2011. That was the big scheme inside my mind. However, Bolivia anticipated itself, and great that they did it because we gained 1 year, and they decided to bring a resolution forward to recognize the right to water. And I did not forget to mention sanitation because their draft only contained water. And the process was very secretive. I had heard there was a draft. Contrary to the usages inside the UN, the draft was not being shared. There were no open consultations with other governments. There was nothing. So it was secret. So I said, let me jump into a plane and let me go and talk with the Bolivian ambassador in New York. Because I was worried that the rumors I heard only referred to water. I arrived there. He did not give me the draft. He just showed me a piece of paper. And effectively, sanitation was not there. So my objective was not only to congratulate them for the initiative, but to say, Mr. Ambassador, please include sanitation. My first report to the Human Rights Council was precisely on sanitation, because I had realized that sanitation was the poor parent of the family. It's a taboo issue. Who wants to talk about shit? Who wants to talk about stuff that smells, that is not sexy, right? So it was neglected. It wasn't being paid devoted attention to, etc. Also, without wanting to be very technical on these matters, also the UN and the UN human rights system had worked on the right to water, but not on the right to sanitation, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Because I was thinking I want the rights to get recognized in 2011, I said I need to start working on sanitation in order to leverage them, to put them at the same level and not to have people, governments telling me, no, we just recognize water because no work has been done on sanitation. So I said, let me row a little bit more when it comes to sanitation. So I mentioned lots of issues regarding sanitation to the ambassador. I left him a copy of my report, and the ambassador said, I will put sanitation in, and this is a promise. This is my business card. Call me whenever you want. I came back home, and every 10 days or so, I would call the ambassador, and he would systematically answer, Catarina, don't worry, sanitation is in. Because I would hear rumors of governments of states that threatened to call for a vote if sanitation was kept. They would allow only water, but not sanitation to the mix. And eventually, it was adopted on the 28th of July. The US called for a vote. Nobody voted against. There were just abstentions. And then this served as a great basis to give more visibility to water and sanitation, which also paved the way, as you were saying, Susan, to including a self-standing goal in the SDG framework in the 2030 development agenda. So there is goal 6 on water and sanitation, which is something we didn't have under the Millennium Development Goals. But also very interestingly, right, the only 2 human rights that are specifically, explicitly mentioned in the whole 2030 agenda are gender equality and water and sanitation. So this was part of a massive lobbying, massive for me, significant lobbying exercise, lobbying efforts that were done at different levels with different stakeholders before and during the negotiations for the 2030 agenda. On a more picturesque note, I was in New York when there was this hurricane Sandy, and we were forbidden to leave our hotels during the hurricane and in the aftermath. And one of the co-chairs of the working group that was negotiating the SDGs wanted to see me, the ambassador of Hungary. And he said, come over. And I said, Mr. Ambassador, I'm watching the news. They don't allow us to go out. I cannot, but I need to discuss SDGs and water and sanitation and the goal. And I wanted to. And I said, but Mr. Ambassador, I'm afraid of going out. There are things falling off. I'll send you my driver. And I eventually went. He was in jeans, I was in jeans, very informal, but it was good, right? To start putting the pieces of the jigsaw. And obviously, civil society was massive, and civil society enormously helped in lobbying governments during the discussions and negotiations. Now, what does this mean? How does this change things? Let me tell you another story. I like to tell stories. Back then, during the Millennium Development Goals era, Kofi Annan, the then UN Secretary General, before Ban Ki-moon, created a body called United Nations Secretary General Advisory Board on Water and Sanitation, UNSGAB, how it was called. And back then, it was chaired, when I was rapporteur, at least in the first years of my mandate, it was chaired by the now King of the Netherlands. He was then Prince William Alexander. And I had heard that within that group, the UNSCAP, there were maybe 2 people who were in favor of the rights, but all the others were against. So I managed to get invited to speak at UNSCAP. There was the IMF, other international, the World Bank, other international financial institutions, OECD, the European Commission, so lots of people in their either institutional capacity or even in personal capacity, but people who had belonged before to IFIs, who had a very skeptical approach to the rights to water and sanitation. So I managed to get invited to the meeting. It was in Sofia, in Bulgaria. And I went to the meeting and I was allowed to give a presentation about the rights and why the rights were important and connecting them to the Millennium Development Goals and the future development agenda. And I remember, and I hope I'm not committing any inconfidence, that several of the members were very skeptical, including the then Prince. He was asking me questions because he's a very practical person, and he was asking your question, Susan. What does that mean? What's the difference? I tried to do my best. 2 years later, I meet with the Prince in the Netherlands, and he comes to me and says, Catarina, let's organize a joint side event on the human rights to water and sanitation at the margins of the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Do you want to do it with me? And imagine. And I obviously said yes. And in the meanwhile, I think it was the discussion, but it was also the fact that he had met with people. For example, one of the stories he told me was that he met with a slum dweller in Nairobi who had told him that now that the rights are enshrined in the Constitution, I can claim them. It's not a favor that anyone is giving me. It's my own right. I can claim, I can demand the government to make it a reality for me. I have the right, my family has the right, my kids have the right, and it must be. And why does it also make a difference? Because the rights are not about poetry in motion. It's not about nice ideas. They are very tangible and concrete, and they entail very concrete obligations for states. For example, recognizing the right to water, or the right to sanitation for that matter, means that this right needs to be affordable. What does it mean? It means that it cannot cost me more than what I can pay. It cannot imply, it cannot force me to make impossible choices between paying for the pharmacy or the supermarket bill or the water bill, as was the case of many people that I met with, including in highly rich countries as in the US, where I saw women who were devoting 18% of their household income to water because they had to drive long distances, buy bottled water, the water they had was contaminated, etc. So the obligations are very concrete and specific, and this allows people, it empowers people, as the example of the slum dweller who talked with the now king. It empowers people, but it also gives clear guidance and instructions, marching orders to the governments, right, in order for them to progressively realize these rights, make them a reality. I will pause here.
Catarina, thank you so much. And I could listen to your stories all day. Just absolutely brilliant. And I think if anybody can bring the secret corridors of the UN alive, it's you. And I cannot believe that you actually went out in the middle of Hurricane Sandy to meet this ambassador. But it's also fascinating, right? In the midst of a water event, a water catastrophe, here you had to go and talk about the right to drinking water. So I think that there's a poetry in motion there.
No, it's a poetry in motion. And you know what? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I remember talking with, again, the king, who was telling me that Hurricane Sandy was a powerful weapon in favor of SDG 6. And you know why? No, and it's true. Because many of those diplomats that were negotiating the SDGs, they lived in New York skyscrapers, right? And because the power failed, it meant that the water was not being pumped up, which meant that ASGs, Assistant Secretary Generals of the United Nations, high-level diplomats of the United Nations, had to, and I know several of them, had to carry water up the stairs in their buildings to bring water to their families. All of a sudden they realized, wow, this is what is happening throughout the world. Oh, maybe this deserves an SDG.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Catarina. I wanted to speak a little bit about one thing that you mentioned. You talked about state obligations and you talked a little bit about affordability. And I think we can get into that discussion a little bit more. But I wanted to ask about other actors, because there is no doubt for me that, and for a lot of people, that water has increasingly just become a commodity. From something which is so precious and maybe even for many communities, something which is sacred, over time, it has just become this commoditized, commodified good, something which can just be traded between people and nations. And here I wanted to know, what about these private actors who hold so much power in this business of water? And what about actors like the World Bank and IMF, who have also played, let's say, good faith roles when it comes to water? The World Bank, for example, many of their conditionalities have kind of emphasized this privatized nature of water. The IMF, a lot of their austerity has meant that governments cannot allocate money towards social goods. So I'd really love to hear more from you on this.
Thanks, Susan. Other actors, they have responsibilities when it comes to the rights to water and sanitation, and they have a responsibility of doing no harm. So they cannot take any actions that put the realization of this right in danger. That's number one. And number two, and I'm talking about the theory, then I'm going into the practice. And then governments, the state, has the obligation to making sure that these other actors behave appropriately, right? They must create an environment, a regulatory environment and a legislative environment that makes sure that these private actors respect the rights. For example, we were talking about tariffs before and affordability, right? You cannot just, as a state, you cannot just simply allow the private sector to come in, a private utility, and give them total freedom to set the tariffs that they want, right? To charge whatever they want. No. The obligations are still on the government. It's not just a question about washing your hands, because it's the government that has the obligation to realize these rights. And then the government can say, I say the government, I'm using government and state interchangeably, which is not correct. But very often, the executive arm of the state is the government. And for that reason, I talk about the government. But the government decides, it can be the government, it can be the legislative power. They decide we will allow the private sector to enter our country and provide for water and sanitation. Very often this is done when the state has problems. And then they think that they wash their hands, they delegate to the private sector, problems will be solved. No, problems will only increase. And you need to have these rules and regulations, even, I always say, an independent regulator, good human rights mechanisms in place to make sure that no matter what the form of service provision, the services are of quality, they are affordable, they don't discriminate against anyone. We don't just bring services to rich communities, right? That can pay a lot. We bring them, we even prioritize the most marginalized and vulnerable, etc. So it is true that when this is not done, there can be problems, and we have seen problems. We have seen problems in many places of the world. And but it is also true that there are mechanisms that can be put in place in order to counterbalance these dangers. Let me give you an example. I'm Portuguese. So there are different forms of service provision, including by the private sector. It's a small proportion. But for example, a municipality is not allowed to negotiate directly with a company, because the assumption is that the municipality is small, that the municipality does not have much power, they don't have much experience in negotiating with these big multinational companies, right? The multinational companies have big companies, big lawyers, well-paid lawyers, etc. So there is a huge power imbalance. And in Portugal, it's mandatory that the regulator comes on board to the negotiations in order to even out the imbalance between the two. So what I'm trying to say is that there are mechanisms that can be put in place in order to make sure that the power imbalance is mitigated. Also, it's the state that should be defining the tariffs. It's an obligation of the state to define the tariffs that take into account the needs of the most marginalized and vulnerable, the need to set social tariffs or exemptions or whatever. This should never be left to the company. Now, it is true that what I'm saying is the theory. In practice, very often, this does not happen simply because there are no institutions in place, or because the institutions, I visited countries where the institutions are in place, but they don't have the human resources. The human resources are very often captured by, for example, the private sector or others. And so the power imbalance is still there. Or you have a regulator, but the regulator is underfunded, under-resourced financially in terms of human resources. So in practice, things don't work. Now, one thing that I tend to look at the bright side of things. So all these problems exist. It's also true that when these problems, and I think the private sector has learned, when these problems are not solved, meaning when the state does not take control, when the rules of the game are not well defined, when the tariffs are not defined beforehand, or the zones of intervention. There have been cases where the private sector has been brought on board to serve a city, and then there was a bit of the city being left out where the slums were, for example. And these are all time bombs that have exploded in the hands of the private sector. Well, also in the hands of the state, obviously, but in the hands of the private sector, which has meant that in some of these places, the private sector has pulled out because for them it was a lose-lose situation, reputational risk, etc. So in that sense, I think that the private sector, at least a certain private sector of a certain dimension, has been paying more attention to all of these risks and has been more demanding in terms of what is the enabling environment that is in place for me to step in. When it comes to the World Bank, for example, to what you were mentioning, to the conditionalities, I hear a change in the discourse. Maybe not across the board, but when it comes to water and sanitation. And I've been in several discussions with the World Bank recently where what they say is something different, right? They say something different. Maybe because of all the bad things that have happened, because of all the scandals, because of all the problems that came up. What I now hear is that they are neutral when it comes to the form of service provision. There might be differences in opinions between headquarters, country offices, etc. When it comes to your reference to the IMF, we have seen it across the board. It is true. We have seen it in developing countries. We have seen it in the global north. We have seen it in Spain and in Greece and in Italy and in Portugal after the 2011 crisis, even in Ireland, when the IMF intervened with the World Bank and others to give the rescue packs. I think it's not an intelligent approach because at the end, when it comes to water and sanitation, and let me focus on water and sanitation, and I think that COVID gave us a very good, sad, hard and fair lesson. And I think it's only when it reaches the rich people that I think it makes a click and people understand. Equality makes sense. It's not only a good principle, it makes sense. Because if not everyone has access to water and sanitation, right, you cannot stop the spread of diseases. And it's also the reason why during COVID, certain things happened that should have been already in place before, as, for example, stopping the cutoffs of water of people who could not afford. This was sold as a major victory. And I remember thinking, but this is what human rights already have been saying for decades, that nobody should be deprived from the human right to water if they cannot afford it for reasons beyond their control, because they are sick, they don't have a job, whatever reason, right? If the services are unaffordable to them. But because, now me being a bit cynical, because the lack of water for the poor affected the health of the rich, we all of a sudden froze the cutoffs in many parts of the world. But basically, going back to what I was saying, it's not an intelligent initiative not to invest in social goods and in not making sure that they are universal. Because water, sanitation and hygiene, they are a precondition for universal health. They are a precondition for economic growth. They are a precondition for making sure that the right to work and that the right to education become a reality, that gender equality becomes a reality, etc. So I think that COVID brought very harsh lessons to everyone, but all of a sudden it became so obvious. What was already obvious for some before became extremely obvious for everyone then. Let me just give you an example. In May 2010, I thought, let's make a call to action, a global leaders call to action on COVID and water and sanitation. And all of a sudden I saw all these global leaders and head of UN agencies wanting to sign. I remember the Director General or Secretary General of the International Labour Organization recording a video saying water and sanitation are indispensable for jobs. And we knew it. But having him say that, record a video on his phone in front of the ILO building, I thought was super powerful because, yes, that's what it is. So it's from a principle point of view, it makes sense. But also from a very practical and even selfish point of view, it also makes sense.
We'll be back after a break. Thank you so much, Catarina, and for bringing up COVID-19, because that was actually going to be my follow-up. Because I definitely, in looking at the news in the last 2 years, there's no doubt that COVID-19 has in a way become a kind of a leveler at some scales. And like you said, certain things which we almost found to be kind of difficult truths have now just become so self-evident. And I think it's like people have nowhere to hide. So they really have to just do what has to be done. And I think that the way the disease has unfolded and the way the recoveries have also unfolded have left people with no choice but to accept all of this.
Now, for me, there is just one question. How do we make sure that we don't forget, right? Because our memories tend to be short. That's why I don't like this expression, building back. I don't want to build back. I want to build forward. I want to build forward better. I don't want to go to what we had before. What we had before was bad. It was bad for the poor. It was bad for the most marginalized. It was bad. And we have an obligation to have learned from this horrible pandemic. We put good policies in place. Let's make them work. Let's make them function in a sustainable manner for the future. And let's also improve them because they weren't perfect. But let's not now just pretend that all is good. Okay, these were just temporary measures. Let's forget. No.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Like you said, human memory, very short. And here, this is something that you've now brought up a couple of times, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about this, which is inequalities and non-discrimination. So fundamental to human rights discourse, and not just to human rights discourse, but to any discourse around justice. You spoke about how it is grassroots struggles that really pushed and mobilized for the right to water. And I think you explained that so beautifully. You have something at the General Assembly, but then you have this entire movement which drove it. How can we discuss these issues without discussing really about who has access to water? And here I wanted to speak a little bit more about issues of gender, caste, race, disability, because these are really kind of the fundamental questions when it comes to water and sanitation. Because if the right people cannot access it, then it almost makes no sense at all. And yet these are the divisions that exist all over the world. You talked about the US, and I think from your own visit there, you saw those divisions exposed. But then a country like India, where you have gender and caste, and how that sort of interfaces. So I'd really like to hear more about you on this. And that term that you used, how do we build forward?
Susan, inequalities were, for me, in my mandate as rapporteur, I think what kept me moving and what kept me fighting. And I always used to say that it's the stories and the faces and the voices of the people that I met that continue to accompany me throughout the years and still do accompany me. And it's this sense of profound injustice, the sense of profound injustice, and you made the connection with justice, that drives you nuts, that makes you angry. I remember my second mission as rapporteur was to Egypt. And I remember that I landed in Cairo during the day. And when you are landing, you see this huge desert, you see the Nile, everything white, yellow, the sand. Then you start coming closer and you see houses and houses and houses with swimming pools, right? One of the driest and most water scarce countries on earth. Then you have meetings in ministries, all the drivers washing cars, right? Using water freely. You ask the people in the ministries that you meet with, the diplomats, the civil servants, how much do you pay for your water? Nobody knows. The price is so ridiculous and insignificant that there was no person in a suit who could tell me how much they paid for their water. They don't know. They don't know. It's ridiculous. Then you go to slums. Nobody has water. Right? And you say, what is happening in this country? And then you see what is happening. What is happening is that people who are connected to the formal network are being subsidized. Okay? They are being subsidized. As I was saying, the tariffs are ridiculously low, which means that it's taxpayers' money that is keeping those tariffs low. And who is benefiting from that water? The people in the formal network who are living in the better parts of the city. Those who live in informal settlements or rural areas, they don't benefit from the network. They need to buy water from informal vendors that sell them the water for a much higher prices, 10, 50, 100 times more expensive than the price of water in any European capital or in New York City. It's just this upside down, right? When it comes to gender, the same. I remember girls in Kenya, in the town, where Obama's father was born, beautiful girls, with these shiny eyes, intelligent, fantastic, who told me, when I asked them, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be president of the United States, not even of Kenya, of the United States. And after coming back from school, they had to fetch water. They could not go to school while they had their periods because the toilets were broken down. And when they came back from fetching water, there was no electricity for them to do their homework. And for all of these groups, for example, the Roma in Slovenia, when I talked with mayors who told me, no, I cannot, I cannot, off the record, they tell me, we cannot support the Roma. I cannot give money, invest in making sure that the Roma get access, because then I'm not re-elected. It's very simple. We perpetuate the discrimination in exchange of re-election. Very clear, very simple. And these are the people who are, many of them, stigmatized. And you talked about caste. I did not go on an official visit to India. I visited Bangladesh. That has a bit of, they don't call it the caste system, but, well, they have the street sweepers and etc., which is basically the same. It's a group of people who are assigned to cleaning and to being manual scavengers, living in appalling conditions, unimaginable, unexplainable. I'm still seeing them in front of me. And these are people who very often don't have a voice. Like, I forgot to mention indigenous people, they don't have a voice. And when decisions are made at the national level, at the capital, they don't take the rights of these people into account. I remember before 2015 saying publicly, because I said, let me say it publicly, because then I can be criticized if it doesn't work. I said, if we don't have inequalities, the elimination of inequalities in the SDGs, we will all have failed. And at least that is included in the SDGs. SDG 10 on the progressive reduction of inequalities, and also, for example, in SDG 6, the one on water and sanitation, I think if you combine it, universal access with reduction of inequalities, well, what this means also mathematically and scientifically is that you need to reach out to the most marginalized first. You need to accelerate progress there more if you want to achieve universal access, meaning end inequalities 2030. And of course, I understand that bringing services to the most marginalized can be more expensive. I understand. And I understand that bringing services to the low-hanging fruits is easier. And I also understand that financial resources are not unlimited. I understand all of it. But I also understand that the human rights framework does not impose a one-size-fits-all solution, right? It doesn't mean that everybody everywhere has to have a sewage treatment plant in their village or have flush toilets. That's not what it means. It means that what the human rights framework means is that we can find, that should even find, different solutions adapted to the different contexts. Also because flushing toilets are not the best in the context of the climate crisis that we are witnessing. And there are cheaper solutions that are even more sustainable in place that can be replicated in different parts of the world. In my opinion, it's all about political will. If there is political will to end inequalities, when it comes to water and sanitation, we can get there. What I've seen throughout the world is that people are willing to contribute. Even the poorest people, they are willing to contribute to making that right a reality. So in my view, it's a question of, first and foremost, political will. And if there is political will, even other actors will come and will make sure that these rights become a reality. Also, when I talk about political will and about making these rights a reality, we often think about money. But very often it's not about money. It's about policies. It's about legislation that discriminates against people. For example, if you have a slum, right? And if you don't allow the water company, be it public or private, we don't care, to make connections, right? To establish the connections because this is an informal settlement, then the problem is not financial. The problem is a legal one. There is a legal impediment that does not allow for the connections. And of course, this legal impediment is not there by accident. It's there because there is stigma against people living in informal settlements. If the problem with the Roma people is not solved, or with people from certain castes is not solved, it's not because there are lack of resources. It's because there is a stigma against these people, right? And behaviors are not changed. Even there is this conviction that the situation they are in is deserved, right? So there is no drive, no incentive to change it.
Thank you so much, Catarina, and I absolutely agree with you. And thank you for mentioning one thing, which was water subsidies, when you talked about that. Because not only are the rich subsidized, but so are sort of industries and big agriculture.
I did not even mention that. I was in Jordan, the water for agriculture, which brings them lots of, revenues and remittances, it's true, is being subsidized, right? And they have water 24/7, while many people I met had to put their alarm clock for 3 o'clock in the morning to fill up the jerry cans, etc. And instead of working with the farmers and telling them, look, let's grow other crops that are less water demanding. No, they were allowing them to grow their tomatoes and their oranges that we are purchasing in the global north also. So we are all responsible.
No, absolutely. I think we are going to be coming to a water reckoning, and we are not there yet, but I think signs are there that there's going to be this huge thing around food and energy. And you talked about flushing toilets earlier, and we'll talk a little bit more about the climate discourse now. But thank you for mentioning this. And the other thing that I also noted, which is that not only do people not have access to, let's say, clean drinking water, depending on their race, their caste, their gender, but it's also that they are then disproportionately affected by polluted and contaminated sources. They are the ones who live close to extremely contaminated groundwater.
Or to groundwater, to a stream. Can I tell you a short story? In Bangladesh, I visited a very small little town, and the groundwater was contaminated with arsenic. And when I talked with people and I told them, but aren't you worried about the arsenic contamination? What they told me was, we cannot have the luxury of being worried about arsenic, because arsenic will kill me in 30 years, right? Because it builds up in your body, it will eventually bring me cancer, etc. I need to survive now. I need to cook. I need to drink. I need to give water to my family. Arsenic contamination, being worried about it is a luxury. So imagine.
Oh my, that's really quite a story. It's scary. It's absolutely scary. I'm sort of curious, Catarina, because, I come from a human rights background. I was a lawyer. I worked in the United Nations human rights system for many years. But, I left that a couple of years ago, and I've decided to delve into other territory. And part of that territory has been sort of looking at how some of these discourses, especially human rights in a way, they are very human-centered. They are very human-focused. And especially when it comes to kind of, let's say, an issue of water, we are talking about a force which is much bigger than us. We are talking about something that consumes, let's say, 70% of the Earth's surface. It is something which we are composed of in our own bodies. So this is a far bigger force, a far bigger territory that we can imagine. And yet we sort of confine it, let's say, within a little house called human rights. I was sort of curious in terms of your own work and also in terms of the challenges that we face in terms of climate discourse. How can we kind of expand this rights territory to also look at how we impinge on the rights of non-humans, animals, or like many people say, more than humans? And what does that relationship look like? A lot of times we talk about nature, but we are also part of nature. So I'm really curious to hear your views on these subjects.
Thank you, Susan. I don't know, maybe half an hour, 20 minutes ago, you also touched briefly upon issues related to the spiritual and religious aspects of water. And let me say that I'm also a lawyer. And my starting point with water came from this more legalistic approach. And much of what you mentioned now, and also this more spiritual side, was completely foreign to me, something I hadn't dealt with before. I started reading, and I must confess that somehow I didn't get it until, let me start with one thing and then I'll mention the other to you. I visited an Indian tribe in the US, and I had read about the spirituals and religious aspects of water. For me, I'm Westerner, right? I'm European. So for me, that was so far away, so distant, so incomprehensible until I went there. And I understood the importance of water is for rituals, for their own rituals, right? And I understood that what was being done with the building of a dam in the region was affected all their spiritual rights and practices, etc. They believe that they come from salmons and that they go back to salmons. The fact that there was a dam there that was elevating the temperature in the river meant that the salmons were disappearing. So they were losing their soul. And of course, when you read it in a paper, you find it awkward. I must confess, I found it awkward. Also because of my upbringing, my education. When I went there, I understood it, right? Also, when you talk about climate and when you talk about other beings besides humans, there are two things I would like to say. I think that the human rights framework is a bit limited. We can expand it a little bit if we talk about environmental rights and the rights of future generations. I agree that when we talk about the rights of future generations, it's still very human-centered. But when we look at the right to a healthy and safe environment, then we are broadening the content and a little bit more. Also, I think that the SDGs and Sustainable Development Goal 6 is much broader than the Millennium Development Goal targets we had on water and sanitation, which were basically the toilet or the latrine and the tap. And now SDG 6 looks at what is there before, what is there after. Of course, it doesn't still look in such an comprehensive and maybe such an honest manner to these other dimensions, but I think at least it gives a step forward when compared with the Millennium Development Goals. The message being that none of us will get access to water and to sanitation if the water that is upstream and downstream is not of good quality. And it is true that, and when we talk about integrated water resources management, these concepts of water for nature, excluding, humans, but of course not all the humans, is being contemplated. The water that is necessary to keep ecosystems, etc. So that is present, and that is present in SDG 6. But it is true that we tend to have this more micro approach and vision. I hope that the SDGs force us to go beyond. I also think that more than the SDGs, local grassroots groups are making the difference at national level.
Thank you so much, Catarina. And it's just been such a wonderful conversation with you. So I would like to end with this question, which is, what are your next projects? What are your plans with your organization? And where do you see the next big shifts when it comes to water and sanitation? We've already talked about some things we know that are going to come up. Things like food, water, energy, the nexus between all three. But I'm curious in terms of your own work and your own projects, in terms of where you think your energy is going to be devoted in the time to come.
So my organization is a partnership, right? It's hosted by the UN, but it's a partnership of governments, but then also other stakeholders as civil society, academic institutions, international organizations, regional organizations, also the private sector. And we didn't talk about it. Small scale private sector, which is the one that brings services to so many people that are not being provided with the services by their own state because of lack of interest, lack of profitability, lack of whatever. So for me, the big new issues are unfortunately big old issues. And I think, again, inequalities. Putting the furthest behind first. Another issue that we didn't talk about, but I know is also very dear to you, Susan, is the issue of accountability. So we are making a big push in terms of accountability. We put in place a mutual accountability mechanism that is functioning at the national level, that links up to other national accountability mechanisms, and that we bring them up to the global level. We want to link it. We want to crystallize it. It's already crystallized, but we want it to become the official accountability mechanism until SDG 6, at least for the access to water and sanitation targets of SDG 6. So I think that inequalities, in terms of the themes, inequalities and accountability are key. Then what we continue to do, and I was talking about political will, it's the reaching up. We are aiming at having presidential compacts. We are aiming at reaching out to heads of state, heads of government, members of parliament to bring the topic up, and then reaching out, establishing alliances with other sectors. You mentioned climate, you mentioned nutrition, let's mention health, let's mention finance, economy, etc. So reaching up, reaching out, attracting more political will, and then with political will comes the rest. And political will needs to be infiltrated with this idea of fundamental that we need to be held to account, we need to end inequalities.
Thank you so much. When you said reaching up and reaching out, I was also thinking that we need to reach in terms of our own relationship to water, and maybe connecting a little bit with that spiritual and with that more sacred nature of it. So thank you. I'd like to sort of ask, now that we're reaching the end of the conversation, if you have any final thoughts for our listeners, and it can be on any of the questions that we brought up, or it could even be in a broader sense in terms of how you sort of see the future as it's going to unfold. So any final words, and we will wrap up.
Thank you. Basically, my final words are that very often we as human beings feel very far away from power, from those who make the decisions. And we feel very often that our actions don't matter, that we don't have a say, that we cannot contribute, and that we cannot make a difference. I think we can. And I think that once we start understanding more about issues that we care about, and once we start talking about them with our neighbors, with our friends, inside our families, we can create movements and we can change the world. We have the power to change the world. We have the power to say, I will not drink bottled water because of the plastic. Of course, I know that in certain parts of the world, this is impossible. Or even though I can afford bottled water, I don't think this is good for the environment. And even though I have a plan B, which is bottled water, let me fight for the plan A, which is tap water for everyone. When I go to the supermarket, let's make sure that if I can choose between beef and chicken or beef and vegetables, let me choose the less water intensive type of food. If I can choose between buying clothes and clothes that I can afford, or not buying them because of the impact on the environment, let me choose not to. Let me choose to buy 3 things a year, for example, maximum. So I think that we have the power. And I think that if we start talking with our friends, families and neighbors, we can create a movement. There is already a movement going on, and it can only become bigger, and it must become bigger because the way we are behaving right now is not sustainable and won't bring us to a world where everyone has access to water, sanitation and hygiene for all the dimensions of their lives. Thank you.
Catarina, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you join us today. And I have to just say, it's always so inspirational. And I just love your positive, vibrant, dynamic energy. So thank you. You've really made my day.
I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks to Catarina de Albuquerque for sharing her thoughts with us. The Suburbs is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Suburbs is produced for us by Waka Media.